Well, I would say that generally when trying to derive a comprehensive measure of social class, researchers would like to have information on a broad range of indicators. So this may range from the person's family background, education, job, wage earnings, to maybe the type of living conditions, whether the person lives in a proper or own house, owns a car, owns a mobile phone, etc. However, in practice, to simplify matters, and also because of a frequent lack of the relevant data for this type of analysis, what you see is that, especially in the economics literature, the definition of middle class is based on only a monetary criterion. And we may argue that this will often be kind of an inadequate approximation of the actual social status of this person. On the other hand, for those approaches that have used alternative measures such as education or occupation, for example, what we very frequently see is that these studies face the difficulty that they cannot really distinguish the middle class from the upper class, especially when working, say, with opinion survey data where you may have very broad categories for these variables. And then last but not least, there are studies that draw on the self-perceived class status of a person, and here the main challenge that researchers face is that generally respondents tend to overproportionally place themselves into the middle class due to something that we would call like a peer or reference group effect. So what this means is that basically everyone knows somebody who's poorer or someone who's richer than oneself, and this kind of explains this tendency towards the middle. First of all, probably not only for the case of South Africa, but more generally speaking in the emerging and developing country context, I would strongly argue in favor of using a definition of class that not only looks at the current standard of living, but also takes the opportunities for upward or downward mobility into consideration. And, well, depending on the type of data set that you have, this idea may be operationalized in various ways. And in my own research, I experimented with two different approaches. So one, in a paper that I did together with Professor Mira Leibrand and Rocco Sisamir from the University of Cape Town, we worked with panel data from the NITS study, and we actually modeled or tried to estimate the risks that a person faces of falling into poverty, and then used this to kind of differentiate what we would call an actual or stable middle class from a much more vulnerable group that has an above average risk of falling into poverty. And then in another study where I worked with a cross-sectional opinion survey, I kind of chose a more multidimensional approach. So on the one hand, I had an asset index as kind of a, if you want to, objective measure of living standards, which I combined with two subjective indicators, one capturing social or self-perceived social upward mobility, and the other one rather capturing overall life satisfaction, and thereby trying to kind of give a better idea of the types of opportunities a person in the different social strata have to actually improve the quality of life. Well, I think I would agree and disagree at the same time, if that's possible. So on the one hand, I think it's hard to doubt that South Africa, or the average living standard in South Africa, is clearly higher than in most African countries south of the Sahara. At the same time, we may want to note that South Africa is one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal countries worldwide, if you want. And what we see when especially applying those vulnerability criterion that I talked about is that at most 25% of all South Africans can be classified as stably middle class or elite, which is still a relatively small share, and also implying that the other 75% are still rather poor or vulnerable to poverty.